Undercover boss orders toast at his café freezes. When Waitress shares tips barely buy groceries, Michael Foster, the 50-year-old CEO of Sunrise Café, sat quietly in the corner of the cafe he had built himself disguised as an unfamiliar customer. Outside light rain fell on the glass window, reflecting the soft yellow light inside the cafe. The atmosphere, once so familiar to him now, carried a hint of unfamiliarity, like a painting that someone had smudged. He sat there silent, observing everything like a slow-motion film. Jessica, the young waitress, her eyes, showing exhaustion, walked up to his table with a wooden tray that had aged over time. She gently placed the still-warm plate of toast and a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple, blending with the dark circles under her eyes that she tried to hide behind a forced smile. Her voice trembled weak, like the last breath of a fading hope. I can only afford one meal a day, boss." Michael was stunned. His hand tightened around the coffee cup, feeling the heat seep through his fingers, like a reminder this place, Sunrise Café, had once been a second home for her, for all of them, those who had placed their trust in him. His eyes hardened, and a tear fell onto the tray of toast, like a knife slicing straight into his heart, bringing back beautiful memories now tarnished by injustice and deceit. The staff's tips, each small amount collected from their dedication, were unfairly divided, turning hope into injustice. Just one small change from him implementing a fair and transparent tip-sharing policy would be enough to ensure that staff like Jessica could afford to eat every day. A harsh truth that Michael never thought he himself had allowed to happen. Michael Foster, the 50-year-old CEO of Sunrise Café, sat in deep thought in the corner of the cafe, the yellow light from the ceiling lamp illuminating his graying hair. He no longer wore the usual neat suit of a CEO today. He wore a simple shirt with the sleeves slightly rolled up like an ordinary customer, his eyes filled with contemplation. Even his tie had been removed so he could blend into the cafe's atmosphere as naturally as possible. Because today Michael wasn't the CEO of Sunrise Café, he was a stranger, a man with a heavy heart about what was happening in the very place he had worked so hard to build. Sunrise Café, the cafe that had once been Michael's greatest pride, had now become a picture completely different from what he had dreamed of. From the very first day of founding it, he had intended for this place to be more than just a place that sold coffee and toast, but also a second home for all those who chose to stand behind the counter in front of it and beside each other, to light up hope and faith. A place where even the smallest tips became a source of motivation for each staff member. A place that Michael had always proudly called the home of smiles. Yet lately he had started hearing complaints from customers about the lack of dedication and service. Revenue reports showed a decline. More resignation emails flooded in than toast orders during peak hours. Those letters, those seemingly meaningless lines had pierced his heart like daggers. Every resignation letter was a big question that Michael could not ignore. Why were they leaving? How had his Sunrise Café changed? And most importantly, was there anyone left holding on to the faith that had once helped him build this brand? Unable to sit in his office reading reports or listening to dry reports from subordinates, Michael decided to investigate himself. He knew that only by seeing for himself, listening for himself, and feeling for himself could he find the real answers. So he put on his old coat, donned a regular baseball cap, and stepped into his own cafe as a stranger. His eyes paused on every worn wooden table on every wall that had turned a warm yellow over time, where once hung photos commemorating the grand opening days, photos filled with laughter and hope. From the corner where Michael sat, he could see everything: the bar where baristas were busily preparing drinks, the toast counter where Jessica, a young waitress with disheveled hair and dark circles under her eyes from staying up late, was arranging the plates of toast. The POS machine beeped steadily like a soulless heartbeat. The yellow light filled the room, illuminating tired faces and the worries of people Michael had once promised to care for like family. Every footstep of the customers, every whispered conversation, and every averted glance of the staff deepened his concern. What has changed here, Michael asked himself. He remembered those early mornings when he stood behind the toast counter, his hands trembling as he divided each tip fairly among the staff, their eyes bright as the night stars. Back then, Sunrise Café wasn't just a coffee shop. It was his dream, a place where hope could be nurtured and grow. But now that dream was shaking. No more clear, starry eyes from the early days. No more cheerful stories during breaks. No more laughter spreading like the morning sun. Only sighs and cautious footsteps remained. Michael knew he had to find the answer that only a CEO who had once put his whole heart into this place could find. And to do that, he needed to return to where he had started to be a stranger again, listening and understanding with the heart of a founder. And so he sat there with a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, his eyes following every movement of Jessica and the other staff. Outside, the first rain of the season dripped on the cafe roof, mingling with the gentle jazz music. But in Michael's heart, a different kind of rain was falling, a rain of unanswered questions, a rain of responsibilities he knew he had to face. Can I save Sunrise Cafe? Michael wondered, his eyes glowing with the determination of a man who had once stood up to build a dream and was now ready to stand up to protect it from falling. This was the beginning of a journey he never thought he would have to make a journey, to find justice, to bring back the smiles to the faces of those who had once called this place their second home. And he knew this journey would not be easy. But Michael Foster had never been one to shy away from hardship. Michael sat silently in the corner of the cafe, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the hot coffee cup to his lips, his breath slow as if listening to the cafe's very heartbeat. The warm yellow light shone on his gray-streaked hair, highlighting his eyes that were both cold and deeply pained, the eyes of a founder witnessing his own spiritual child changing. Amidst that atmosphere, Jessica appeared like a faint brushstroke in a once vibrant painting. That young woman was still diligently working her tired eyes, her hands deftly wiping tables, arranging toast movements so familiar yet filled with a hidden sadness. Michael noticed that she was always scheduled for the low customer shifts, her hesitant gaze watching as other colleagues were favored with peak hour slots. Every step she took across the wooden floor seemed to carry the weight of all those tired mornings when she couldn't afford a decent meal. When Jessica placed the plate of toast on his table, her lips were tightly pressed together, her voice trembling, as if she were holding back something that had been waiting a long time to break free. Tips are not enough for me to afford. Even a proper meal, sir. Michael was stunned. Each word she spoke felt like a dagger, piercing straight into his heart. He clearly remembered the old days when he himself divided the tips, when everyone's eyes sparkled, when those small coins were not just a reward but also a symbol of trust, the reason they continued to stick with the cafe. Now Jessica, the young woman who once had the brightest smile behind the toast counter, was telling him a bitter truth that numbed him to the core. In that moment, the air thickened as if every sound in the cafe was suffocating. The gentle jazz music suddenly fell silent, the POS machine beeped like a cold, sharp knife. And then, as if fate had planned it, a janitor passed by with a dripping mop in hand, his voice drifting out half like a monologue, half like a bitter message to the room. Here, the ones who work the hardest are also the ones who get the least. Michael was struck silent once more. Those words, so brief, were like a mirror, exposing everything he did not want to believe. Sunrise Cafe, the place he had once built as a second home, had now become a place where those who worked the hardest received the least. Tips had been distorted, trust stolen. The fair tip-sharing system of the old days had disappeared, replaced by something cold, indifferent, and betraying. A cold sweat trickled down Michael's temple, mixing with the pounding of his heart, the heartbeat of a founder witnessing his dream being torn apart. He understood this was the beginning of a journey to reclaim justice for Jessica, for the staff who had once called this place home, and for himself, the man who had once promised that Sunrise Cafe would be the house of hope. In the faint morning light, Michael knew that he could no longer turn away. Michael took a sip of coffee, but the familiar bitterness now burned his throat. He set the cup down on the table, his breath slightly ragged as he listened to his own sigh, blending with the whispers of those who had once called this place home. The golden light from the hanging lamp highlighted every wrinkle on his face, reminding him of the days when he smiled brightly as he shared the tips with the staff. That light now seemed to mock his very heart. He turned his head toward the toast counter where Jessica was standing. She continued diligently arranging the toast wiping tables, welcoming customers, each movement practiced yet heavy. The golden light cast a glow on her hair, catching a bead of sweat sliding down her cheek. In a brief moment, her gaze settled on her colleagues laughing at the busy peak hour counter, where the tips were plentiful, where every face shone brighter. Jessica looked at them, then quickly bowed her head, as if afraid her own eyes would betray the courage that had already been worn down. Michael clearly saw her small hands trembling, those small fingers, gripping the toast tray like it was the only thing keeping her from falling into the depths of despair. Michael could hear his own heartbeat, each beat echoing like a knock on the door of an old world he once believed in. A world where trust was shared like tips, where people were treated with heart, not by cold numbers on a POS screen. Jessica turned to look at Michael, her eyes like a deep pool, holding tears that had yet to fall. She set the plate of toast down in front of him, her voice catching in her throat, as if she were on the verge of tears but didn't dare let them fall. Tips aren't enough for me to afford even one full meal, sir." In that moment, Michael felt frozen. Those words were like a cold, sharp blade piercing straight into his heart, not only because they exposed the truth, but because they reflected Jessica's eyes from long ago, innocent eyes that once believed that if she worked hard enough, every an effort would be rewarded. Those eyes now were nothing but the ashes of a hope that had burned out. The POS machine beeped like another knife slicing through the thick air. Michael looked up, his eyes landing on the figure of a janitor passing by a mop, still dripping with soapy water, his faded uniform soaked with the sweat of silent labor. He paused, his gaze distant, as if he were talking to himself, but his voice carried just enough for Michael to hear. "Here, the ones who work the hardest are also the ones who get the least." Michael closed his eyes, his breath caught in his chest. That short sentence, just a few words, cut deeper than any stolen tips. It exposed a harsh reality. Sunrise Cafe was no longer the home of hope he had promised, but had turned into a place where injustice waited to crush the dreams of those who had sweated here. The dim golden light, the silence of the jazz music, and the steady beat of Michael's heart all felt like a bell tolling, calling him to face the truth. A system he had once trusted completely had betrayed the core values he had poured his heart into building. More clearly than ever, he saw Jessica standing there, a small girl, but carrying the pain of a Sunrise Cafe that was falling apart. Michael clenched his hand, a chill running down his spine, but his eyes still burned with the same fire. The fire of a founder determined to reclaim justice for the people who had once called this place home. He knew this was the moment he had to rise, not as a CEO sitting in a closed conference room, but as a founder who once believed that fairness could begin with a single shared glance. In the golden light falling down, Michael lifted his head high, his eyes meeting Jessica's, and then the other employees like a flame rising in the darkness. Because he knew even one tear, one spoken word, could change an entire system if he had the courage to act. And he knew he was ready. Michael sat quietly in a corner of the cafe, the golden light falling across his hair, like the last rays of sun resting on the shoulders of a weary traveler. The coffee cup in his hand trembled slightly, the hot liquid, carrying the bitter taste of someone watching his own creation falling apart. He took a deep breath, his eyes drifting across every corner of the cafe, every brick that he had once laid with love and hope. But now Sunrise Cafe was no longer the second home it once was. Near the pastry counter, Michael noticed a group of young employees, their uniforms crisp and neat, walking confidently, their eyes gleaming with a kind of smug self-assurance. They were assigned to the busiest shifts, the peak hours when tips were at their highest. The golden light fell on their faces, illuminating smiles that seemed a bit too triumphant, as if they had already secured their rewards. Michael could clearly see the difference in their eyes, a look that had once been familiar in the early days but now bore the hue of privilege. A kind of privilege quietly arranged somewhere behind the pastry counter. And then there was Jessica, the young woman who that very morning had stood by the tray of toast, her hands trembling, as she said that tips weren't enough to buy a proper meal. Now she was bent over arranging slices of toast, each motion heavy with exhaustion. Her eyes were lost, her hands clutching a sorrow she couldn't name. Michael watched more closely and saw that she was always scheduled during the slow hours, the shifts when tips were so low they barely covered a cheap loaf of bread. The golden light highlighted her cheekbones, sweat rolling down and collecting at her collar, undeniable evidence of the grueling hours that never seemed to be enough. Michael clenched his fists, his breath catching as his gaze settled on the POS counter. A young employee's hands danced over the keyboard, fingers flying over the touchscreen, the cold blue light from the screen illuminating his face, his eyes reflecting a suspicious glint. Michael furrowed his brow as tips appeared and then vanished from the screen, as if that blue light itself were devouring the sweat and tears of people like Jessica. He could hear every cold mechanical beep, a sound that once symbolized transparency and fairness, now turned into a bitter reminder of betrayal. Like a cold wind brushing his memory, Michael recalled those early days when he himself divided the tips among the staff. Their eyes back then shone like stars, the eyes of people who believed every drop of sweat would be fairly rewarded. He remembered that feeling, that pride, that sense of being a founder who kept his promise to build a place where fairness wasn't just a slogan, but a lived reality. But now Jessica had been quietly recording the missing tips, the unfair shift schedules, the tricks of a group of people who were slicing up the sweat of their colleagues. Every sheet of paper she kept was like a silent plea for help. Her handwriting trembled as if even her fingers were afraid. Michael knew she was scared, scared of retaliation, scared of being shunned, scared that if she spoke up, she'd lose the one thing that kept her afloat day by day. A helpless tear fell onto the edge of the paper, soaking into the numbers like a wordless plea. Michael looked up, his eyes blazing with an unyielding fire. Each breath he took was heavy, as if carrying the pain of all those who had trusted him. He could hear his own voice, hoarse, but as strong as steel forged in fire. Did I let this happen? In the golden light streaming down the crow's feet around his eyes stood out marks of years of dedication, sleepless nights, and promises he had once laid on the shoulders of Sunrise Café. Michael knew now he wasn't just confronting a manipulated POS system, but an entire system that had betrayed the very dream he had poured his heart into building. Michael's gaze shifted toward Jessica, that young woman who had now become the symbol of the injustice Sunrise Café was facing. Michael made a silent promise he would not let another tear fall because of tips being skimmed. No one was allowed to betray the people who had treated this place as their second home, because he knew that just one small change, one right decision could save it all. And he was ready. Michael lightly brushed his hand over the stack of papers Jessica had compiled, pages trembling like her very heart. The dim golden light illuminated the lines, blurred with tears, each number, each date and time, skimmed all of it, crying out to him. Part of him wanted to rush out and confront those who were siphoning off the staff's sweat, but he knew that without solid proof, everything would be buried in silence, and any accusation would dissipate like wind against a rock. And those people would continue to exist, like ghosts feasting on the hopes of people like Jessica. He stood up and quietly walked toward the POS counter, his eyes scanning the faces, pretending to be busy. A brief glance from a young staffer, a glance avoiding his eyes full of guilt, made his heart ache. That boy still stood there, hands flying across the screen, the practiced movements of someone who had done this countless times. Michael noticed the blue glow from the screen, lighting up his face, reflecting the look he despised most. The look of someone complicit in wrongdoing, the look of someone smiling over the tears of others. He tried to contain his anger, his breathing turning ragged. His heart pounded like a battle drum, reminding him that if Sunrise Café was ever a home, then right now he was stepping into a fight to reclaim that home. Not just for himself, but for Jessica, for the people who had believed in him, who had believed in this place. Michael glanced back at Jessica. She was bent over wiping tables, her eyes weary, her shoulders trembling under the weight of endless shifts. In the yellow light, a bead of sweat rolled down her cheek, falling onto the toast tray like the tears he'd seen before. Each drop is like a painful question. Why do I work so hard, yet still have to live in fear in this place? He wondered. What dream was shattered? The day he founded Sunrise Café, he had sworn that no one would ever be treated with contempt, that no one would ever be looked down upon. But now here he stood in that very home, facing a system that had betrayed the dream he had built. Michael heard the familiar beep of the POS, a sound that once made him trust in transparency. Now each beep felt like a dagger slicing his dream into shards. He took a deep breath. A thought flashed through his mind. Could he really turn things around in a single night? That question made his heart tighten. But then his eyes burned with unwavering determination, the eyes of a CEO, of a father, of a founder, who had once stood behind the toast counter and divided every single tip with all his heart. Michael knew there was no other way but to face it head on. He would expose every falsified figure, every threatening message. He would reclaim this home, not by throwing money around, but by the same transparency and fairness he had sown from the very first days. He turned back to look at the cafe, Sunrise Café. The golden light fell on every face. Some looked up at him, some quickly looked away, as if afraid his gaze would see right through their hearts. But he knew just one tear, like the one Jessica had shed, could change the entire system. One tear could make every scheme evaporate in an instant, leaving no place for deceit to hide. Michael felt his heart pounding, carrying both hope and pain. He whispered, his voice hoarse, but firm like a knife slicing through the darkness. I won't let a single tear be left behind. I will restore justice for everyone. In the golden light, Sunrise Café seemed to return to being that second home, the place where Michael placed his trust that every effort would be rewarded and every sincere heart would be treated fairly. And this time he would stand on the front line like a beacon, like a flame, like a promise. Michael stood up, and the old wooden chair beneath him creaked softly like a bell of awakening amidst the thick scent of coffee and the sweat of those suffocating mornings. The golden light from the ceiling lamp shone on his face, the face that bore the marks of countless sleepless nights, the sweat and tears that had been poured into building Sunrise Café from the days it was just a small shop tucked into a street corner. He looked around the cafe, his eyes sweeping over each face, each averted glance, each trembling hand, and each heart beating with anticipation. His eyes shone brightly, the eyes of a founder who had once invested all his trust and heart into every brick, every small corner of this place. And today, he, as the spiritual father of Sunrise Cafe, would do the most righteous thing: restore justice to its rightful place. Michael raised the stack of papers marked with evidence, the pages soaked with the sweat and tears of people like Jessica. On each page were tip amounts, mercilessly altered work schedules, twisted like a maze, and messages threatening staff printed out like daggers, aimed straight at the heart of trust. The golden light illuminated the stack of papers, revealing every word like blades, ready to cut down all deceit. His voice rang out deep but strong, each word like a hammer, striking the fortress of injustice that had gnawed at Sunrise Cafe for too long. This is your sweat and tears stolen by these very managers. From today, every single tip will go to those who truly deserve it. The air in the cafe froze. Every breath caught in everyone's throat. The sound of the POS machine beeped like a warning in the dark night. The manager lowered his head, his shoulders trembling, as the blue light from the POS screen shone on his face, highlighting beads of sweat rolling down his temples, the sweat of shame of a system that had thought it could forever exploit the POS. Tears of people like Jessica. Jessica, the young woman who had once made Michael freeze when she confided that her tips weren't enough for a decent meal, now stood tall, her eyes glistening with tears. But those were no longer tears of fear or resignation. There were tears of a hope being reborn, of justice being called by its true name for the first time after so many months of silent endurance. The golden light shone on her face, transforming her into a beacon of hope for all those who once believed that Sunrise Cafe was their second home. Michael cast a steadfast gaze at Jessica, the gaze of a founder who had risen from the very pain of people like her. In that moment, he knew today wasn't just a day to expose a fraud, but the day he stood up for the promise he made long ago. The promise that at Sunrise Cafe, every effort deserved to be rewarded, every tear had its worth. The camera slowly panned in on Michael's eyes, eyes that glistened with an unwavering spark of faith, eyes of a founder who once shared every single tip with all his heart. In that golden light, a bead of sweat trickled down his forehead, merging with the golden light, reflecting all the hopes, all the tears that had once fallen on Jessica's toast tray. The POS machine beeped. That sound was no longer the sound of exploitation, but the sound of revival for a Sunrise Cafe, a place where justice was finally called by its rightful name. Michael knew this moment wouldn't just change the fate of one young woman, but was the turning point for an entire system, a place where the light of faith would erase the darkness of injustice. And he was ready to make Sunrise Cafe a second home for everyone, just as he had promised from the very beginning. The gentle golden sunlight streamed through the glass window, illuminating Jessica's face, the young woman who had once shed tears before her toast tray. Now she stood tall, wearing a crisp manager's shirt, her eyes beaming with faith and hope. Michael watched her from afar, his heart sinking for a moment before swelling with pride. There was a time when this young woman could afford only one meal a day, but today she stood here as a symbol of resilience and justice. Jessica had been promoted to shift manager, not just as a reward for her hard work, but as an affirmation of justice. She became a role model for all the staff. Her eyes shone every time she shared the tips, and her words radiated empathy and fairness. Now Sunrise Cafe's employees could afford to live no longer forced to skip meals or eat leftovers. Everyone was treated as a vital part of Sunrise Cafe, a place where every drop of sweat was repaid fairly. Michael was amazed to discover such a simple solution: just implement a transparent tip-sharing policy, fairly distributed by shift and time. Add a small sign next to the checkout, explaining to customers the importance of tips, a gentle but powerful reminder. And yet it was enough to change an entire system that had rotted from greed. A solution that could be applied today, no complexity, no hesitation. One click on the POS and the tip-sharing policy changed. A short meeting, Michael stood in the middle of the cafe, his eyes ablaze with determination. From today, every tip will go to the one who truly deserves it. That was all just one decisive decision, but it changed the entire Sunrise Cafe. A beep from the POS machine rang out like the vow of a CEO who once shared every single tip with all his heart. The camera slowly panned to Jessica, guiding the new staff. Her smile shone like the first rays of the sun, the golden light highlighting her eyes, eyes that now held hope once again. She spoke, her voice gentle but firm. These tips belong to you, the fruits of your labor, and you deserve them. Michael stood silently, his eyes shining with pride, his eyes slightly misty. In that moment, he understood that Sunrise Cafe was not just a coffee shop, but a second home, a place where every drop of sweat was valuable, a place where every tear was dried by faith. He thought to himself, one tear has changed an entire system. One tear small but enough to stir the heart of a CEO, enough to revive a Sunrise cafe where fairness had once fallen asleep. How many more waitresses live on tips they never get? That was the question Michael asked himself, and it was the question he wanted the audience to ask themselves, so that together with him, they would stand up and reclaim fairness for the people who had sweated to keep Sunrise Cafe's lights on every day. Because fairness is not just a number on a revenue report, but how you look into the eyes of the people who have sweated, the people who keep Sunrise Cafe's lights on every day. Fairness is in the very hands that are willing to wipe away their sweat in the very heart, strong enough to stand up, and in you, the one who dares to call fairness by its rightful name.